The air on Zolara was thicker than the skulls of the politicians Vesper had to deal with. She stepped off her rust bucket of a spaceship, affectionately named the Diplomatic Disaster, and was immediately reminded why she hated planets. The gravity felt like a clingy X. "Welcome," her AI companion, Riff, chimed in her earpiece. Zolara, where they put the fun in fundamental societal collapse. Vesper shot a glare at the invisible voice. "You know, sarcasm really doesn't suit you, Riff. You should leave the personality to the professionals." "That's what you're here for," Riff replied, too smug for a piece of software. "Remember, you're the envoy. Try not to get shot. Again." "Noted," Vesper muttered, adjusting her jacket. She walked toward the makeshift conference center, which was actually just a tent that looked like it had survived more shelling than a beachfront bunker. As she approached, she could hear the sound of voices arguing. Loudly, of course. Inside, the two factions at war were gathered around a table that could barely hold their collective disdain for each other. The Gorthons, with their steroid-fueled physique and permanently angry faces, sat across from the Sleens, who looked like they'd gladly stab you in the front and then the back for good measure. "Ah, the human has arrived," a Gorthon leader, Burak, roared with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for last meals. "Perhaps she can teach you Sleens how to surrender properly." Vesper stumbled slightly but caught herself. "Hey, before we start measuring egos, how about we try diplomacy first? I hear it's all the rage in civilized galaxies." The Sleens leader T-Ren leaned back, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Civilized? You humans still believe peace is achievable. That's adorable." "Yeah, well, we also believe in toothbrushes, but I see we're ahead of you there too," Vesper shot back, trying to hide her nerves with wit. Humanity wasn't exactly known for subtlety in these parts, or competence, but hey, they had spirit, often mistaken for stupidity but spirit nonetheless. "I have a question," a Sleen interrupted as if an idea had just smacked him in the face. "Why did they send a human? We're durable," Vesper replied. "And cheap, mostly cheap." Burak's laughter filled the tent. "Ah, humans, always the jokers." "Tell us, human, do you really think you can save this planet from itself?" "Save it? Oh no, I'm just trying to get out of here alive and with most of my limbs intact," Vesper said with a grin that felt more like a grimace. "But you know, saving the planet would look great on a resume." The conversation devolved into the usual back and forth of thinly veiled threats and insults. Vesper slouched in her chair, trying to piece together the politics like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. It was always like this. Everyone thought humans were naive, an easy target, until they realized that their resilience was less about intelligence and more about stubbornness. "Vesper," Riff's voice buzzed in her ear. "You're going to want to hear this. Now." "Can't you see I'm busy not getting my head bitten off?" she huffed. "It's important," Riff insisted, and she knew better than to ignore urgency in an AI voice. Excusing herself, she stepped outside, hoping for a moment of peace. Instead, she was greeted by the harsh reality of Zolara's landscape, barren, war-torn, and perpetually gray, like it had taken a bet to see how depressing it could get. "All right, spill it," she said, crossing her arms. "Our sensors picked up an energy spike," Riff explained. "Big enough to fry city blocks," Vesper sighed. "And you think this is more important than me getting insulted by aliens with inferiority complexes? Considering it might be a weapon that'll make sure you don't have to worry about insults ever again, yes." "Great," Vesper muttered, rubbing her temples. Of course, things couldn't just be simple. "Do we know where it came from?" "Deep in the Gorthon territory, but there's chatter it's something new, something experimental," Vesper cursed under her breath. "Okay, we need to verify. Can you pull some strings, get some eyes on the ground?" "Already hacking the satellites," Riff replied. "I love my job." She was about to return inside when a Sleen soldier blocked her path. His expression was as friendly as a snake with a migraine. "You going somewhere, envoy?" "Just stretching my legs," Vesper lied, flashing a smile that said, "Trust me, I'm a human." "You know, these meetings can be tense." "Be careful, human," the soldier said, leaning in. "Zolara has a way of chewing up outsiders and spitting them out." "Good thing I've got sharp teeth," Vesper replied, stepping past him. She re-entered the tent, her mind racing. If there was one thing she knew, it was that ignorance wasn't bliss. It was fatal. The meeting dragged on, a showcase of animosity and thinly veiled threats, wrapped neatly in a package of false smiles. Vesper played her part, nodding at the right times, throwing in a joke or two, all while her mind was elsewhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of posturing, the meeting concluded. The factions parted ways, leaving Vesper to her own thoughts. "What now?" Riff asked, as Vesper walked back to her ship. "Now," she replied, glancing at the sky, which seemed to scowl back. "Now we find out if I'm dealing with a new weapon or just the same old stupidity." Her ship, the diplomatic disaster, was waiting like an old friend who never asked questions. She boarded, and the familiar hum of engines was a comfort, a reminder that at least her ship wouldn't stab her in the back. "All right, Riff," she said, settling into the cockpit. "Let's see what kind of trouble we're in." "You mean other than the usual?" Riff quipped. "Yeah, besides the usual." As the ship lifted off, Vesper couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something obvious. But then, that was the thing about humans. They were always missing something obvious, right up until they weren't. The diplomatic disaster soared over the war-torn landscape, and Vesper couldn't help but chuckle. Here she was, trying to mediate peace between two species that would rather see each other wiped out. While back home, humans were still arguing over taxes and whose god was the most muscular. "You know," Vesper said, watching the landscape blur beneath them, "if I had a credit for every time someone underestimated a human, I wouldn't be stuck in this job. But then you wouldn't get to enjoy the thrill of near-death experiences," Riff retorted. "And where's the fun in that?" "Touché," Vesper replied, as the ship sped towards the unknown energy source. "Let's hope whatever we find doesn't kill us. At least not before I get a chance to gloat." The journey was short, and soon they were hovering over a section of land that looked suspiciously empty. "There," Riff said, highlighting a barely visible structure. "Looks like a research facility." "Ah, the infamous research facility," Vesper said, "where oops becomes a valid scientific term. Shall we take a closer look?" Riff asked. "Let's," Vesper said, guiding the ship down. "And remember, act like we belong." "Because we do," Riff replied, "if belonging means being in the wrong place at the wrong time." The ship landed, and Vesper stepped out, surveying the facility. It was quiet, too quiet for her liking. Not a soul in sight, just the hum of machinery. "I'm getting a bad feeling about this," Vesper muttered. "You always get a bad feeling," Riff pointed out. "That's because I'm always right," she shot back. She approached the entrance, which slid open with an unsettlingly smooth hiss. Inside, her footsteps echoed eerily, the only sound in the sterile halls. "Riff, see if you can tap into the systems," Vesper whispered, feeling like she was part of a bad holodrama. "Already on it," Riff said, "and we're in. Surveillance is down." "Good," Vesper replied. "Now let's see what these idiots are up to." As she moved through the facility, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Rooms were hastily abandoned, and the occasional scorch mark on the walls suggested a hasty evacuation or a disagreement that ended with plasma. Finally, she found what she was looking for. A lab with equipment Vesper couldn't identify if her life depended on it, which it very well might. "Riff, any idea what this is?" she asked, eyeing the setup suspiciously. "Looks like they were working on some sort of energy weapon," Riff replied. "Experimental, unstable. Those are my favorite adjectives," Vesper said dryly. "Can you download the data?" "Already done," Riff confirmed. "Good," Vesper said, turning to leave. "Let's get out of here before." She never finished the sentence because at that moment alarms blared to life, deafening in the enclosed space. "Ah, hell," Vesper muttered, breaking into a run. "Riff, what's happening?" "Looks like they set up a failsafe," Riff explained. "The facility is going to self-destruct." "Of course it is," Vesper hissed. She sprinted down the corridors, the countdown echoing in her ears like a particularly unpleasant heartbeat. Behind her, the walls began to shake, and she could feel the heat of the impending explosion. Bursting out of the facility, Vesper threw herself into the diplomatic disaster, slamming the hatch shut behind her. "Punch it, Riff," she shouted. Get us out of here. The ship roared to life, leaping into the sky as the facility below erupted in a massive fireball, a fitting farewell to yet another botched negotiation. Well, Vesper said, catching her breath, that went better than expected. You have a strange definition of better, Riff noted. Yeah, but I'm still breathing, aren't I? Vesper replied, grinning despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. As the ship flew back into the relative safety of the atmosphere, she couldn't help but chuckle. Humans might not be the smartest species in the universe, but damned if they weren't the luckiest. So, Vesper said, leaning back in her seat, do you think this will make the peace talks more interesting? If by interesting you mean explosive, then yes, Riff said. Great, Vesper replied. I do love a good fireworks show. And as the diplomatic disaster soared off into the horizon, Vesper couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, humanity's special brand of ignorance was exactly what Zolara needed. Vesper leaned back in her seat, the diplomatic disaster humming its way across the drab, crater-pocked landscape of Zolara. It was a patchwork quilt of despair, each grim square telling a story of conflict or, more likely, someone's latest failed attempt at diplomacy. The air was thick enough to spoon-feed and the gravity felt like a personal vendetta. Just another day in paradise. Riff, Vesper began, remind me whose brilliant idea it was to come here again. Yours, the AI replied without missing a beat. You wanted to make a difference. That does sound like something I'd say in a moment of questionable sobriety, she mused. But was it worth the view? Hey, those gray clouds come in at least 3 different shades of desolation, Riff quipped. It's practically a rainbow of misery. With the immediate threat of being blown to bits behind her, Vesper's mind wandered back to the ongoing peace talks. It was like watching a herd of cats trying to form a jazz ensemble, entertaining from a distance but ultimately pointless. This new energy spike and the subsequent explosion had thrown a wrench into the already rusty works of diplomacy. Think this prophecy is going to help or just blow more smoke up everyone's skirts? Vesper asked. If you ask me, and you didn't, prophecies are usually like adding a gallon of gasoline to an already raging fire, Riff said. All you get is a bigger, more exciting disaster. There's just something about being the outsider in a prophecy that makes me want to roll my eyes so hard they risk orbiting Zolara. Maybe it's your destiny to be the cosmic punchline, Riff suggested. Vesper snorted. Wouldn't be the worst job I've ever had. She guided the ship towards the makeshift conference center, which looked about as temporary as a politician's promise. A tent in the middle of a war zone, dedicated to the noble but naive pursuit of peace. It was like putting a Band-Aid on a black hole. Burak, the Gorthan leader, was waiting outside, his imposing figure resembling a boulder with a temper. Gorthans were known for their physical prowess, and Burak was their poster child, all muscle and bluster like a sentient battering ram. Ah, human, Burak rumbled as she approached. Back from your little adventure. Yup, alive and kicking, Vesper replied, motioning to the charred edges of her jacket. Though my wardrobe might need a new sponsor. Burak chuckled, an unsettling sound like rocks grinding together. Perhaps you should try wearing armor like a proper warrior. Good idea, Vesper said. I'll get right on that as soon as I figure out how to bend my knees in one. They entered the tent, where T-Ren, the Sleen leader, awaited them. He was as slippery as a greased eel and twice as charming, with a sharp wit that could cut through the thickest of silences. Vesper, T-Ren greeted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I hear you've been playing with fireworks. Just a little field trip, Vesper said casually. Thought I'd see what else this planet has to offer besides cheerful locals. Ah, well, you know the saying, T-Ren replied. If you can survive Zolara, you can survive anywhere, mostly because nowhere else wants you. Vesper chuckled, taking a seat. So what's this I hear about a prophecy? T-Ren's expression shifted, growing more serious. Ah, yes, the prophecy of Zolara, an ancient tale about an outsider who will unite our divided world. Let me guess, Vesper said, leaning forward. Step 1, survive the locals. Step 2, avoid getting blown up. Step 3, fix everything. More or less, T-Ren said, his smile returning, this time with a hint of malice. The factions believe the outsider will bring about a new era of peace, and they think it's me because you're here, alive and not aligned with any faction, Burek interjected, and because the prophecy is incredibly vague, like a horoscope. Great, Vesper muttered. I'm the universe's answer to a vague riddle, Vesper, Riff's voice piped in her earpiece. I've got some intel. Funny thing about this prophecy. Every time someone starts to actually fulfill it, they tend to end up dead in suspiciously creative ways. Of course they do, Vesper whispered back. Because nothing says welcome like a multi-species murder mystery. Burek leaned in, his boulder-like face unreadable. The Gorthons believe strength will unite us. The Sleens think it will be cunning. And you, human, what do you think? Vesper thought about it. I think it's going to take a miracle or a really big explosion. Both valid strategies, T-Ren said with a nod. I hate to break it to you both, Vesper continued, but if you're waiting for me to save the day, you're going to be disappointed. The factions believe, Burek said, voice like thunder, believe that you are the one. Well, they are wrong, Vesper shot back. I'm just here to keep you from blowing each other up. Everything else is above my pay grade. T-Ren's gaze was calculating. Perhaps that's exactly what the prophecy needs, someone who isn't interested in it. Yeah, well, I'm not interested in a lot of things, Vesper replied. Like getting stabbed or vaporized. Call me old-fashioned. Burek crossed his arms, a gesture that suggested he was contemplating breaking something. So what now, human? Now, Vesper said, we focus on not letting this prophecy become a self-fulfilling death sentence. Wise words, T-Ren agreed. For a human. The meeting wrapped up with the usual vague assurances and non-committal grunts, leaving Vesper to wonder if she'd accomplished anything at all. As she walked back to her ship, the weight of the prophecy lingered, like an unwanted guest who refused to leave. Riff, she said, boarding the diplomatic disaster, any thoughts on how I survive being the chosen one? Simple, Riff replied. Don't be the chosen one. I'm listening. We do what humans do best, Riff said. Create chaos, deflect responsibility, and get the hell out before anyone realizes what's happening. Vesper laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed in the cockpit. Sounds like a plan. Let's start with chaos. I hear it's our specialty. As they lifted off, Vesper couldn't help but feel a twinge of hope. It was buried under a mountain of cynicism and snark, but it was there. Prophecy or no prophecy, she wasn't going to let some ancient prediction dictate her future. If the factions wanted a messiah, they'd have to look elsewhere. What's our next move? She asked. Find out who's really pulling the strings, Riff suggested, and then cut them. Nice and simple, Vesper said. Just the way I like it. As the diplomatic disaster soared once again over the grim expanse of Zolara, Vesper couldn't help but smirk. There were worse things than being the universe's cosmic punchline. At least she was in on the joke. Vesper drummed her fingers on the control panel of the diplomatic disaster as it hummed along through Zolara's murky skies. She could almost taste the tension in the air, and it didn't help that the air on this planet was thick enough to chew. The conference center loomed below, a hodgepodge of tents and hastily constructed buildings that seemed more suited for a music festival than peace talks. Riff, remind me again why we're trying to play mediator between two factions that would rather see each other vaporized, Vesper asked, her voice dripping with irony. Because you're an optimist with a poor grasp of self-preservation, Riff replied. Or possibly because the funding for this mission is just good enough to keep you in cheap booze and cheerful cynicism. Ah, the allure of intergalactic diplomacy, Vesper muttered, piloting the ship down toward the landing area. Can't believe I traded my old gig, running illicit cargo and bad jokes, for this. From smuggler to savior, Riff quipped. Or at least a very well-paid babysitter. They landed with a thud that rattled every bolt in the rust bucket they called a spacecraft. Vesper stepped out into the thick atmosphere, her boots sinking slightly into the mud, a fitting metaphor for the talks themselves. She was greeted by the sight of Burek, the Gorthon leader, arguing with T-Ren. Both looked up as she approached, their expressions a mix of frustration and thinly veiled hostility. "Ah, Vesper," Tyren said, plastering a smile on his face like a bandage over a bullet wound. "Just in time for the festivities. Wouldn't miss it for all the breathable air in the galaxy," Vesper replied, rolling her eyes. "What's the latest?" Burak crossed his massive arms, his frown deepening the crags of his face. "We're getting reports of sabotage. Someone's been tampering with the food supplies and communications." Vesper let out a low whistle. "Well, nothing brings people together like shared misery, more like shared suspicion," Tyren corrected. "Each faction blames the other. Tempers are fraying." "Fantastic," Vesper muttered. "Because what this powder keg needs is more sparks." She glanced around the camp, taking in the tense faces and hushed conversations. It wouldn't take much to push these factions over the edge, and it seemed someone was already hard at work doing just that. "Riff," she whispered, stepping away from the leaders. "Can you run a scan for anything out of place? Something about this stinks." "Way ahead of you," Riff said. "I'm picking up some unusual signals, but they're scrambled. Someone's playing games." "Great. Our mystery saboteur has a sense of humor," Vesper said, shaking her head. "Any idea where it's coming from?" "Hard to pinpoint. It's almost as if they're using the camp's own equipment to bounce the signals around." Vesper sighed. "God, I hate smart troublemakers." "Why can't they all just be dumb thugs?" "Because then your life would be boring," Riff replied. "And we can't have that." Vesper squared her shoulders and headed back to Burak and Tyren, who were engaged in a silent standoff that could melt steel. "All right, boys," she said. "Here's the deal. We need to figure out who's screwing with the peace process before this turns into a full-blown war." Burak grunted. "We Gorthons do not fear war." "That's nice," Vesper said dryly. "But I left my war outfit at home, so humor me, okay?" Tyren smirked. "And why should we trust an outsider to handle this?" "Because I'm the only one stupid enough to try," Vesper replied, raising an eyebrow. "And because if this goes south, it's my head on the chopping block too." The leaders exchanged looks, and after a moment Burak nodded. "Very well, human. But know this. If you betray us, no prophecy will save you." "Noted," Vesper said, turning on her heel and striding away before they could see the anxiety creeping into her expression. Back on the ship, Vesper paced the cockpit, drumming her fingers against her temples. The factions were pressing in on all sides like a pair of aggressive bookends, and she was the flimsy novel caught between them. "Okay, Riff," she said, stopping mid-stride. "Time to think like a saboteur. How do we turn this to our advantage?" "Well, traditionally, sabotage involves creating confusion and mistrust," Riff mused. "Why not embrace the chaos, stir the pot, see what floats to the top?" Vesper nodded slowly. "Not bad. And while everyone's chasing shadows, we can slip in and figure out who's orchestrating this mess." "Exactly. Play the part of the inept outsider who just happens to have a knack for being in the wrong place at the right time." Vesper grinned. "And here I thought my years of bad luck were wasted." As night fell over the camp, Vesper slipped out of the ship, her senses on high alert. The air was cooler, but the tension was palpable, crackling like static electricity. She moved through the shadows, keeping to the periphery of the camp. Her goal was the central communications tent, a veritable spider's web of technology and wires. If someone was orchestrating sabotage, they'd need a vantage point like this. Inside the tent, the hum of machinery filled the air, accompanied by the soft glow of monitors displaying endless streams of data. Vesper's eyes scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. "There," Riff whispered in her ear. "The console on the left, it's been tampered with." Vesper moved closer, her heart pounding. She examined the console, spotting the subtle yet unmistakable signs of interference. A bypass here, a loop there. Whoever had done this was good, very good. "Can you trace it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Working on it," Riff replied. "It's a tangled mess, but I might be able to." The sound of footsteps outside made Vesper's blood run cold. She ducked behind a crate, holding her breath as the tent flap rustled. A figure entered, silhouetted against the faint light. Vesper squinted, trying to make out the details. Whoever they were, they moved with the confident stride of someone who knew they belonged, or at least thought they did. The figure approached the console, fingers dancing over the keys with practiced ease. Vesper's mind raced. She needed to act, but any sudden move could blow her cover and this fragile piece to smithereens. "Riff," she whispered. "Can you create a distraction?" "I thought you'd never ask," Riff replied, and a moment later an alarm blared from the opposite side of the tent. The figure tensed, head snapping toward the sound. It was all the opening Vesper needed. She lunged forward, grabbing the intruder's arm and yanking them around. The face that met hers was unexpected, not a Gorthon or a Sleen, but a human. A man, his features sharp and eyes narrowing with recognition. "Vesper," he said, the surprise in his voice mingling with amusement. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Funny," Vesper replied, tightening her grip. "I was about to say the same thing." The man chuckled, an infuriatingly calm sound. "Name's Jax, and before you ask, I'm not the bad guy." Vesper raised an eyebrow. "That's exactly what a bad guy would say." "Fair point," Jax conceded, raising his hands. "But I'm here to stop this madness, same as you." "Then why the sneaking around?" Vesper asked, not relaxing her stance. "Because the real masterminds are one step ahead," Jax replied. "And they've got plans to use this prophecy as a weapon. They think humans are easy to manipulate, our flaws, our greed." Vesper frowned. "So they think we're the perfect fall guys." "Exactly," Jax said. "But what they don't realize is that our flaws can also be our strengths. Unpredictability, ingenuity, we can turn this around." Vesper considered his words, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "All right, Jax," she said. "I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. For now." "Glad to hear it," Jax replied. "Now let's figure out how to make this prophecy work for us and against them." Together they exited the tent, the camp now eerily quiet as night deepened. Vesper felt the weight of the situation bearing down on her, but for the first time it felt manageable. There was a path forward, albeit a treacherous one. "What's the plan?" Vesper asked, glancing at Jax. "We play both sides," Jax said, eyes glinting with determination. "Feed them enough truth to keep them guessing and enough lies to keep them chasing their tails." Vesper grinned. "Sounds like home." As they moved through the shadows, Vesper couldn't shake the feeling that the prophecy was no longer a curse, but a wild card. One she intended to play for all it was worth, even if it meant rewriting the rules as she went. "Riff," she whispered as they slipped back toward the ship. "Looks like we've got a new ally." "And here I was worried things would get dull," Riff replied, with a note of approval in his digital voice. "Let's keep them on their toes." And with that, Vesper felt the thrill of the hunt, the chaos of the chase, and the tantalizing promise of survival against all odds. Humanity might be flawed, but damn if it wasn't fun to be underestimated. The makeshift conference center was quieter than a mime on their lunch break, which meant things were about to get interesting. Given the stakes, quiet was never a good sign. It usually meant someone was about to blow something up or start a blood feud over an improperly folded napkin. Vesper had just the right amount of cynicism to find that likely and the perfect amount of sarcasm to make it bearable. "So, our master plan," Vesper whispered to Jax and Riff as they pretended to inspect the rust bucket that was the diplomatic disaster, "is to act like we're completely out of our depth." "What could possibly go wrong?" Jax, leaning against the ship with the casual arrogance of someone who spent too long in tight spaces, smirked. "Well, we could accidentally cause a diplomatic incident, or start a war. Or both," Riff added helpfully, his voice crackling in Vesper's earpiece like a sardonic AI cheerleader. "That's the spirit," Vesper said, clapping Jax on the shoulder a little too enthusiastically. "Let's inspire fear and confusion across multiple species. It's like being a bureaucrat but with less paperwork." Vesper's plan was to embrace the chaos, lean into the usual alien stereotype that humans were bumbling fools, and hope the real saboteurs underestimated them enough to slip up. It was a strategy so foolhardy, it was practically a cliché, but if there was one thing Vesper excelled at, it was turning her own ineptitude into an advantage. Not unlike the time she convinced a Sleen smuggler that her ship was a rare Earth artifact. As they ambled through the camp, Vesper made a show of inspecting random objects, squinting at the machinery like it was all written in ancient hieroglyphs. Riff, playing the part of a malfunctioning comrade, occasionally blurted incorrect readings that Vesper loudly argued against. Jax just looked amused, folding his arms and watching the circus. They hadn't even finished a lap when Burak and T-Ren approached, both wearing expressions of barely concealed skepticism. Burak was a Gorthan with fists like sledgehammers, and T-Ren probably couldn't make a fist with the number of olive branches he's been holding. Quite the pair. "What are you doing, human?" Burak rumbled, voice like gravel in a blender. "Oh, just giving everything a good human once-over," Vesper replied, waving a multimeter in the air as if it could actually do something useful in her hands, just to make sure it all meets space code. T-Ren looked like he was trying to swallow a lemon. "Is there such a thing as space code?" "There is now," Jax chimed in deadpan. "It involves a lot of squinting and a thorough misunderstanding of alien technology." Burak frowned, and the lines on his face deepened as if he were considering the possibility of human idiocy being weaponized. "I expect better results." "Then I suppose you hired the wrong humans," Vesper said with a shrug, undeterred by Burak's simmering anger. "But don't worry. We're also really good at being underestimated." Vesper's act of being the naive outsider continued with gusto, and to the amusement of some and the irritation of many, she and her crew managed to blunder their way into several minor diplomatic entanglements by lunchtime. They accidentally cut the power to the Gorthan mess tent, ignited a minor computer glitch that played elevator music through the Sleen's communication system, and somehow triggered a fire alarm that had the Sleens and Gorthans bickering over fire safety protocols. It was almost surprising how much chaos 3 humans could cause without even trying. But that was the beauty of it. The factions were now more preoccupied with blaming each other than noticing Vesper's sleight of hand. "Well, this is going swimmingly," Jax commented, as they watched a group of Sleens argue over whose turn it was to fix the communications console, which was now emitting a sound that was somewhere between a kazoo and a dying bovine. "Swimmingly is what I call it when I drown," Riff added. Vesper grinned. "Everything's going according to plan then. Now let's see if our saboteurs take the bait." Their antics had indeed flustered both factions, and under the guise of human ineptitude, they managed to infiltrate the Sleen supply tent. Vesper rifled through storage crates, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of hidden devices. Transmitters, cleverly disguised as mere storage compartments. Well, our mystery saboteur is a Sleen," she muttered, pulling out a small module and holding it up to her eye level. "Now how do we use this to make our point?" "We could use it to broadcast a message," Jax suggested, his voice laced with anticipation. "Turn the tables, make it look like the Gorthans were responsible." Vesper considered the suggestion. It was risky, but it could work. "All right, let's give it a shot. Nothing like a little misdirection to spice things up." But just as they were about to set the plan in motion, a squad of Sleens entered the tent, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. The leader, a sinewy creature with an expression of perpetual disdain, folded his arms. "And just what are you humans doing?" he asked, his voice dripping with animosity. Vesper quickly tucked the transmitter into her pocket, grinning widely. "Oh, just organizing. You know how it is, one crate leads to another." The leader's eyes flicked to the open crates, his gaze hardening. "Sabotage is a serious accusation." Vesper's smile didn't falter. "Who said anything about sabotage? I was just admiring the craftsmanship of this box." The leader snorted, clearly unimpressed. "You humans are more trouble than you're worth." "That's practically our motto," Riff interjected, earning a glare from the leader. Jax, ever the diplomat, stepped forward. "Perhaps we can be more help than hindrance. Let us work together to find the real culprit." The leader hesitated, glancing between them and the crates. "Fine. But any more disruptions and you'll be answering to more than just us." As the Sleens left, Vesper exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Well, that was close." But we learned something, Jax said, a gleam of determination in his eyes. They don't trust us, but they're not ready to throw us out just yet. Good, Vesper replied. Now let's make them regret that decision. Back at the diplomatic disaster, they huddled in the cockpit, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like the oppressive air of Zolara. Their strategy of feigned clumsiness had shifted the blame temporarily, but tensions were still high. One wrong move, and they'd find themselves in the middle of an interspecies war, and probably with the bill for the damages. So what's next, fearless leader? Riff asked, leaning back in his chair with the nonchalance of someone who was either very brave or very stupid. We spread the word, Vesper decided. Let's slip that the Gorthons are planning something big, something related to the prophecy. That should stir the pot nicely. And while everyone's distracted, we find the real saboteurs, Jax added, nodding in agreement. Exactly, Vesper said, her mind already working through the logistics. We can't outgun them, but we can sure as hell outmaneuver them. A few hours later, as the camp buzzed with rumors and accusations, Vesper slipped through the shadows, her destination the heart of the Gorthon camp. Their security was tight but not impenetrable, and with Jax's help she bypassed the outer perimeter. Inside, the tension was palpable. Gorthon warriors moved with the coiled energy of predators on the hunt, their eyes scanning for any sign of threat. Vesper kept to the shadows, moving with practiced stealth. She needed to find evidence, something to link the saboteurs to either faction. But as she slipped into the central command tent, she realized she wasn't alone. A figure stood silhouetted against the dim light, fingers dancing over control panels. "Hello, Vesper," the figure said, turning to face her. "I knew you'd come." Vesper tensed, recognizing the voice. It was Corin, a Gorthon mercenary with a reputation for ruthlessness. They had crossed paths before, and it had never ended well for either of them. "Corin," Vesper replied coolly. "I didn't peg you for a saboteur." "I'm not," Corin said, stepping closer. "But I know who is." "Do tell," Vesper said, trying to keep her voice steady. Corin chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "You humans think you're so clever, but you're just pawns. The Sleens are playing a long game, and you're right in the middle." "And what about you?" Vesper asked, keeping her eyes on him. "Where do you fit into all this?" Corin shrugged. "I'm just here for the money. But I don't like being manipulated any more than you do." Vesper considered his words, the pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind. "So what do you want?" "To stop this madness before it destroys us all," Corin said, his expression hardening. "The prophecy is just a tool. The real game is power." Just then, the tent flap rustled, and Jax slipped inside, eyes widening at the sight of Corin. "Looks like you made a friend." "You could say that," Vesper replied. "Corin here has some interesting information." Jax nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then maybe we can work together. It's not too late to turn this around." Corin hesitated, glancing between them. "And if I say yes, then we might just have a chance," Vesper said, holding out her hand. After a moment, Corin took it, his grip firm. "All right, human, let's see if we can make some history." With Corin on their side, Vesper and her crew had a fighting chance. The stakes were higher than ever, but for the first time, it felt like they were on the brink of something big. As they left the Gorthon camp under the cover of night, Vesper couldn't help but chuckle. "You know, I think we're just crazy enough to pull this off." "Crazy is what we do best," Riff replied, his voice tinged with humor. Jax grinned. "Then let's give them a show they won't forget." And so, with a Gorthon mercenary and a plan that was as reckless as it was brilliant, Vesper set her sights on turning the prophecy inside out. Because if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was turning the improbable into the inevitable. The night on Zolara was thick and suffocating, like wearing a moist, furry sweater designed by a sadistic fashionista. Vesper, Jax, and their newfound frenemy, Corin, trudged back to the diplomatic disaster with all the grace of a drunk slug. The air pressed down on them, as if Zolara itself was bored with their antics and rather eager to crush them into its unremarkable surface. "So, how does a Gorthon mercenary end up helping humans?" Jax asked, glancing sideways at Corin. He wasn't sure if the Gorthon was more likely to help them or eat them. Corin shrugged, a movement that looked like a tectonic shift given his size. Helping's a strong word. I just didn't want to get caught in the blast when this whole thing goes to hell. Ah, self-preservation, Vesper said with a smirk. The foundation of any good relationship. Riff's voice crackled in Vesper's earpiece, the static making him sound like an ancient deity giving wisdom to mortals. So, what's the plan? Hope the Sleens and Gorthons kill each other and take up knitting. Knitting's too peaceful for this crowd, Vesper replied. We need to turn up the heat, make them sweat. Jax grimaced. Sweating's easy enough on this planet. I feel like I've been swimming in soup. Bad soup, like someone dropped a sock in it. They reached their ship, which looked more like a retired garbage scow than a diplomatic vessel. But it wasn't about appearances, was it? The diplomatic disaster was their fortress of ineptitude, a testament to human resilience and questionable engineering. Inside, they gathered around the cockpit, staring at the dashboard that was missing a few crucial buttons. Vesper tapped a screen that flickered back at her with all the reliability of a used car salesman. Right, she began, assuming the role of a captain who actually had a clue. We need to make the Sleens and Gorthons dance to our tune, Corin snorted. No offense, but you humans couldn't carry a tune if it had handles. True, Jax agreed. But we're not here to sing. We're here to cause a ruckus. Vesper leaned closer to the console, keying in commands with the precision of a cat walking across a keyboard. We plant the idea that each side's planning to betray the other. Let the paranoia do the heavy lifting. Then we wait for them to implode, Riff added, and hope we don't get sucked into the mess. Corin crossed his arms, a gesture that blocked out the cockpit lights. And what do I do while you're playing puppet master? Keep your eyes and ears open, Vesper replied, her tone suggesting she just asked him to do the simplest task. Let us know if things start exploding. Always nice to have a heads up before the fireworks start, Jax said, trying to sound nonchalant. The plan, if it could be called that, was simple. They'd feed misinformation, stoke the fires of distrust, and wait for the chaos to reach a boiling point. Classic human strategy. When in doubt, set fire to the room and hope the smoke clears. Hours passed like a slow-motion car crash, each minute bringing them closer to the brink. The Sleens and Gorthons were already at each other's throats. All it took was a nudge, and they'd be tearing out each other's jugulars. Any word from our friends? Vesper asked, scanning the horizon as if expecting to see the chaos physically manifesting before her eyes. Well, Riff said, his voice as dry as the air on a desert planet, I've heard a few explosions in the distance. Could be a good sign. Or we're about to have company, Jax added, peering out the viewport with a look that suggested he was considering his options for a quick escape. Corin shook his head, a gesture that seemed to encompass his entire upper body. You humans have a strange definition of success. Comes with the territory of being universally underestimated, Vesper replied with a grin that was more wolf than human. A few tense moments later, a message crackled to life on their comm system. It was unintelligible, a mix of static and alien dialects that sounded like someone trying to gargle a sentence through a mouthful of rocks. Charming, Riff said, tapping at his console. Let's see if we can translate this noise into something useful. The translation wasn't perfect, more like a drunken attempt at diplomacy, but the gist was clear. The Sleens were accusing the Gorthons of sabotage, and the Gorthons were responding with their usual brand of eloquent violence. Looks like it's working, Jax said, his relief tempered by the knowledge that success wasn't part of their usual script. Yeah, Vesper agreed, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Now we just have to survive the fallout. The situation on Zolara was deteriorating faster than a politician's promise. Reports of skirmishes between the Sleens and Gorthons trickled in, each more absurd than the last. One involved an argument over who got the last of the good rations. Another was sparked by a disagreement over fire safety protocols, again. Unbelievable, Corin muttered, listening to the chaos with an expression that bordered on disbelief. I knew they were stubborn, but this is something else. Desperation makes fools of us all, Vesper replied, not entirely without sympathy. And we're here to dance on the strings. But the dance was turning into a frantic jig, the kind that leaves you dizzy and regretting last night's choices. The Sleens and Gorthons were at each other's throats, but that only made them more unpredictable, more dangerous. Looks like they're doing our job for us, Jack said, staring at the reports with a mix of admiration and dread. Let's hope they don't decide to take us out as a side project, Riff added, his voice devoid of its usual levity. Vesper sighed, the weight of their strategy pressing down on her. They'd bought themselves time, but it was borrowed at best. Their little charade was teetering on the edge of collapse, and when it fell, they'd have to decide whether to jump or ride it down. So, Corin said, breaking the silence with a voice that suggested he was about to offer sage advice, "What's next, human?" "We keep the pressure on," Vesper replied, her tone firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at the edges of her confidence. "Let them tear each other apart while we find the real saboteurs." The plan was as solid as a sandcastle in a hurricane, but at this point it was all they had. As the night on Zolara dragged on, the world around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. And Vesper, with her crew of misfits and a Gorthon mercenary who may or may not eat them at the first opportunity, knew they were about to step into the storm. But as she looked at her companions, she saw something that gave her hope, determination, camaraderie, and just enough madness to pull it all off. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "Let's make history." And with that, they dove back into the fray, ready to face whatever insanity awaited them on the other side. Because if there was one thing humans were good at, it was turning disaster into opportunity. And if that didn't work, well, they could always blame it on the prophecy. The air inside the diplomatic disaster was as stale as a politician's promise, and just about as reassuring. Vesper sat hunched over the ship's console, trying to look like she knew what she was doing. In reality, she was about 5 seconds away from throwing the damn thing out of the airlock and hoping for the best. Riff's voice crackled in her earpiece, like an old record player that had seen better days. "So, Vesper, any brilliant ideas yet, or should we start practicing our eulogies?" "Give me a minute," Vesper muttered, her fingers dancing over the flickering controls with all the grace of a drunken octopus. "I'm trying to think of a way to use our utter lack of resources as a tactical advantage." Jack snorted from his position against the wall, his arms crossed and an eyebrow raised. "Good luck with that. Last I checked, being underprepared was usually a disadvantage." Vesper shot him a look that could curdle milk. "You should know by now, Jax, that humans are experts at turning weaknesses into strengths. It's like our superpower, that and getting hopelessly lost." Corin, the Gorthon mercenary whose presence still felt like a bad idea waiting to happen, shifted his considerable bulk and grunted. "You humans certainly have a unique approach to strategy." "I suppose when you're always the underdog, you have to be creative." "Exactly," Vesper exclaimed, momentarily forgetting that she was surrounded by what amounted to a support group for the galactically doomed. "We need to lean into this. Let the Sleens and Gorthons think they've got us figured out, then flip the script." "And how do you propose we do that?" Jax asked, his skepticism palpable enough to chew. "By playing into their expectations," Vesper replied, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of hope and reckless ambition. "We make them think we're bumbling idiots." "Not much of a stretch," Riff interjected with a laugh. Vesper ignored him. "And then use that to our advantage. If they think we're harmless, they'll underestimate us. Meanwhile, we keep feeding them misinformation, keep them off balance." "Oh, I get it," Jax said, a grin spreading across his face. "It's like being a clown in a circus full of lions. As long as they think you're just there to entertain, they won't eat you, hopefully." "Exactly. We let them think we're the clowns," Vesper said. "And when they're busy laughing at us, we rip the rug out from under them." The plan, in its own way, was both insane and perfectly logical. "Which, when dealing with intergalactic politics and a planet full of hostile natives, was about par for the course. "All right, I'm in," Jax said, pushing off the wall and stretching like a cat who'd just awoken from a particularly self-righteous nap. "How do we sell this farce? First, we need to make sure the Sleens and Gorthons are watching us," Vesper explained, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd watched way too many heist movies. "We need to act suspicious enough to draw attention, but not so suspicious that they start shooting," Corin grunted. "So, you want to bait them." "Dangerous game. Better than being on the menu," Jax quipped, earning a snort from Riff. Vesper leaned back in her chair, the faux leather creaking in protest. "We set up some fake transmissions, make it look like we're planning something big and mysterious, enough to get them curious. And when they come sniffing around," Riff began. "We lead them on a wild goose chase," Vesper finished, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Keep them running in circles until they're too dizzy to see straight." Jax nodded, clearly warming to the madness. "And all the while, we'll be unraveling who the real saboteurs are, or at least keeping out of their way." The plan was starting to come together, like a jigsaw puzzle assembled by someone who'd thrown away the box. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It just had to be crazy enough to work. "All right, team," Vesper said, standing and adopting her best captain stance, which was only slightly undermined by the fact that she was wearing mismatched boots. "Let's get to work." As they set about laying the groundwork for their deception, Vesper couldn't help but marvel at how quickly chaos had become their ally. It was almost comforting, in a way, knowing that their greatest asset was being underestimated. Like a poker game where the other players were too busy laughing at your hat to notice you had a full house. Within Iors, they'd set up a series of broadcasts that were just vague enough to sound dangerously important. The kind of messages that screamed, "We're up to something," while offering absolutely no detail. The trick was in the delivery, just enough secrecy to be intriguing, but not so much that it smacked of an obvious trap. "Think they'll bite?" Jax asked, watching Vesper as she fiddled with the last of the settings. "If they don't, they're dumber than I thought," Vesper replied. "And if they do, well, they've just played right into our hands." Corin tilted his head, considering. "And if they see through your ruse?" "Then we improvise," Vesper said with a shrug. "And hope for the best." The air inside the diplomatic disaster was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that crackled like static electricity. They'd set their trap, and now all that remained was to wait and see who would stumble into it. A few Iors later, their patience was rewarded, or punished, depending on your perspective. The Sleens and Gorthons had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. Reports were coming in of increased activity on both sides, a flurry of accusations and counter-moves that suggested the factions were gearing up for something big. "Looks like they're buying it," Riff noted, monitoring the transmissions with the air of someone waiting for a particularly juicy gossip column to drop. "Good," Vesper replied, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. "Now we just need to keep them dancing while we figure out our next move." Their deception had set the Sleens and Gorthons scrambling, each convinced the other was about to spring a trap. Paranoia was a powerful motivator, and as the factions turned their suspicions outward, it left them vulnerable to the real threat, whoever was pulling the strings behind the scenes. "We need to be ready," Jax said, a rare note of seriousness in his voice. "If they catch wind of what we're actually doing, things could get ugly." "Ugly's been the theme of this trip," Vesper replied dryly. "But you're right, we need contingencies." Corin grunted in agreement. "Your plan is sound, but I hope you're prepared for the fallout." Desperation makes for dangerous enemies. The weight of his words hung in the air, a reminder that their gambit, while clever, was far from foolproof. The stakes were higher than ever, and failure was not an option. Vesper turned her attention back to the console, her mind racing as she considered their next steps. It was a delicate dance they were performing, one misstep away from spiraling into chaos. The key was staying one step ahead, anticipating the moves of their opponents while remaining unpredictable. They had to maintain the illusion of ineptitude while executing a plan so audacious it bordered on lunacy. As the hours ticked by, Vesper found herself increasingly drawn into the web of intrigue they'd woven. Each new report, each intercepted transmission, added another layer to the tangled mess they were navigating. But amidst the chaos, a realization began to take shape, a glimmer of insight that promised to turn the tide in their favor. It was risky, perhaps even reckless, but it was also exactly the kind of bold move they needed to tip the scales. Vesper leaned forward, her fingers poised over the console as she prepared to put her newfound plan into action. "I've got it," she announced, her voice cutting through the din like a knife through butter. Jax looked up, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "You've got what?" "The way we turn this whole thing on its head," Vesper replied, a fierce determination in her gaze. "We need to escalate the tension between the factions, push them to the breaking point." "And how do we do that without getting caught in the crossfire?" Riff asked, skepticism mingling with curiosity. "By feeding them just enough information to keep them on edge," Vesper explained. "We let them think they are on the verge of uncovering a conspiracy, something big enough to justify their paranoia. It was a risky move, one that could easily backfire if they weren't careful, but it was also their best shot at maintaining control of the situation." "You think it'll work?" Jax asked, a note of hope creeping into his voice. "It has to," Vesper said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Because if it doesn't, we're all screwed." The plan was set, the pieces in place. All that remained was to execute their strategy and hope that their gamble paid off. As the diplomatic disaster hurtled through the endless void, its mismatched crew united in purpose, Vesper felt a sliver of confidence take root. They were playing a dangerous game, but for the first time, it felt like they had the upper hand. And if things went sideways, well, that was a problem for future Vesper to deal with. "All right, team," she said, glancing around at her companions. "Let's make some history." With renewed determination, they set to work, preparing to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because if there was one thing humans knew how to do, it was survive against the odds. And this time, they were betting everything on a hand nobody else saw coming. Vesper sat back in her chair, gazing at the blinking lights on the console like they held the answers to the universe's most profound mysteries, or at least a clue on how to get out of this mess alive. The diplomatic disaster hummed around her, an old beast still pretending it was a star cruiser rather than a flying junkyard. It was home, though, and at least the air was breathable, provided you didn't mind the tang of burnt circuits and regret. "All right, listen up," Vesper announced, exuding a confidence that belied the chaos swirling in her brain. "Time to pull the strings and watch the puppets dance." Jax leaned against a nearby wall, arms crossed, smirking as if he'd already seen the end of this particularly twisted tale. "You sure they're not gonna notice we're the ones holding the strings? Let them think they are in control," Vesper replied, fingers darting across the console to initiate the next phase of their plan. "Pride's a hell of a blinder." Riff's voice crackled through her earpiece, the sound quality akin to someone trying to communicate through a tin can. "You mean like how my pride's blinding me from acknowledging just how stupid this all is?" "Exactly," Vesper said with a grin. "Now, shut up and listen." With a few taps, she sent a false transmission into the void, a tantalizing morsel designed to set the Sleens and Gorthons at each other's throats. It was a delicate balance. Too much bait and they'd smell a rat, too little and they'd ignore it altogether. Like trying to convince a cat to chase a laser pointer without realizing it's just a trick of the light. "Right," Riff said, "so we're dangling a carrot in front of two pissed-off donkeys. What happens when they start kicking?" "Then we hope they kick each other," Vesper replied. "And if they kick us instead, well, we'll cross that bridge when it collapses under us." Corin, the Gorthon mercenary, chuckled, a sound like gravel rolling down a hill. "I've seen many plans in my day, but few as reckless as this." "I admire your foolish courage, human." "Thanks, Corin," Vesper said, not bothering to hide the sarcasm. "We humans thrive on that." Well, that and caffeine. The next few hours were spent in a flurry of activity, the crew working with the sort of frenzied energy usually reserved for people trying to disarm bombs in action movies. They crafted fake communiques and planted false evidence, each step a calculated risk designed to escalate the tension between their two adversaries. "Think they'll buy it?" Jax asked, glancing over Vesper's shoulder at the console displays. "They will if we sell it right," Vesper replied, adjusting a knob here and there until the readings looked just so. "Besides, it's not like they have a better plan." "True," Jax said with a shrug. "They're too busy trying to figure out why their own pants are on fire." Vesper laughed, though there was a nervous edge to it. "Let's just hope they don't figure out we're the ones holding the matches." As the hours ticked by and their deception took root, the first signs of discord began to emerge. Reports from their planted bugs and intercepted transmissions indicated that both factions were indeed falling for it hook, line, and sinker. Like a pair of drunks in a bar, they were ready to start swinging at anything that moved, including each other. "Looks like they're gearing up for a showdown," Riff commented, his voice a mixture of disbelief and smug satisfaction. "I'd say it's working." "Good," Vesper said, allowing herself a moment to savor the small victory. "Now we just need to make sure they don't realize they're being played." Jack snorted. "They're too busy playing with matches and gasoline." The crew continued their work, each member contributing to the deception that was quickly spinning from a simple ruse into an elaborate charade. It was a delicate balance, the sort of high-wire act that left no room for error, but if it worked, it would be their ticket out of this interstellar circus. "Vesper," Corin rumbled, his voice as steady as ever. "What happens when the Sleens and Gorthons finally realize the truth?" Vesper met his gaze, unflinching. "By then, we'll be long gone. Like a bad date slipping out the bathroom window, and if they catch us before then we improvise," she said, the familiar mantra rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. "And pray they are as bad at catching us as they are at diplomacy." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was what they had. And sometimes, in the great cosmic game of chess, you had to make do with the pieces you had, even if half of them were missing and the board was on fire. As the ship shuddered slightly underfoot, Vesper turned her attention back to the console, the familiar hum of the diplomatic disaster a comforting backdrop to the chaos unfolding outside. They were walking a razor-thin line between cunning and catastrophe, but for the first time, it felt like they had a fighting chance. "All right, team," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at her insides. "Let's keep the pressure on and see where this madness takes us." As the crew sprang into action, each member contributing to the carefully orchestrated chaos, Vesper couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They were on the edge of something big, and with any luck, they'd come out the other side in one piece. And if they didn't, well, at least they'd go down swinging. The next day found Vesper in the ship's makeshift conference center, which was more storage closet than strategic command hub. Jax was already there, poking at a holographic display with the caution of someone defusing a bomb. "Morning," Vesper said, plopping down on a crate that smelled faintly of durian, a fruit infamous for its ability to stink out an entire room. "Or whatever passes for morning in this hellhole," Jax muttered. "Looks like our friends are still tangled in our web." "Good," Vesper replied, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Let's hope they keep running in circles long enough for us to make our escape." Riff chimed in over the intercom, his voice laced with amusement. "I'd give them another day before they realize the only conspiracy happening is the one in their own heads." "We've bought ourselves some time," Vesper agreed. "Now let's make sure we use it wisely." Corin lumbered into the room, the floorboards creaking ominously under his weight. "Humans are strange creatures, so fragile yet so persistent." "It's our charm," Vesper quipped. "We're like cockroaches. Impossible to get rid of and even harder to kill. And almost as annoying," Riff added, the intercom crackling with static. The room settled into a familiar rhythm, the crew working together like a well-oiled, if slightly dysfunctional, machine. Despite the odds and the absurdity of their plan, they were making progress. A ping from the console drew Vesper's attention, the notification flashing like a beacon of foreboding. She leaned forward, studying the data with the intensity of someone trying to decipher a menu in a foreign language. "Looks like the Sleens are making a move," she announced, her pulse quickening. "They're mobilizing ships." "About time," Jack said, a dark smile playing on his lips. "Was getting worried they'd forgotten how to fight." "Let's just hope they focus on the Gorthons and leave us out of it," Vesper said, fingers flying over the controls as she adjusted their own ship's trajectory. The diplomatic disaster might not be a battleship, but she was nimble where it counted. Corin watched with interest, his expression inscrutable. "You humans have a knack for surviving against impossible odds. It's impressive." Vesper met his gaze, a wry smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Thanks, Corin. It's a talent we've honed over centuries of being underestimated." The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into eternity as they waited for the tension outside to reach a boiling point. Like a pressure cooker with a faulty valve, something had to give eventually. "Think they'll take the bait?" Riff asked, his voice crackling over the intercom. "We'll find out soon enough," Vesper replied, her eyes fixed on the display. As they watched, the Sleens' fleet moved into position, a show of force that was as much about intimidation as it was about strategy. The Gorthons responded in kind, their own ships forming a defensive line that bristled with weaponry. "It's like watching two drunk gladiators waiting to see who swings first," Jax commented, his tone dry as a desert. "And one of them's about to lose a hand," Vesper added, unable to suppress a grin. It was a dance as old as time, a battle of wills where the first to flinch would pay the price. And in that high-stakes game, Vesper and her crew were the wild cards, waiting in the wings to capitalize on the chaos. The tension in the room was palpable, a living thing that pulsed with each heartbeat. Every eye was glued to the display, each mind racing with possibilities and potential outcomes. Then, without warning, it happened. A single, errant shot, whether fired out of panic, miscommunication, or sheer stupidity, pierced the void between the two fleets, a spark in the powder keg of their making. "Well, there goes the neighborhood," Riff said, his voice a mixture of awe and incredulity. "Looks like they're in it now," Vesper said, watching as the Sleens and Gorthons erupted into chaos, each side convinced the other had fired first. As the battle unfolded, it became clear that their plan had worked better than they could have imagined. The Sleens and Gorthons were too busy tearing into each other to notice the small, insignificant ship slipping away. "Time to make our exit," Vesper said, her voice calm amidst the storm of activity. She adjusted their course, the diplomatic disaster gliding through the chaos like a ghost. "Let's hope they're too busy to notice we've left the party," Jax said, his usual bravado tempered with a hint of relief. With deft hands and a steady heart, Vesper guided their ship away from the conflict, her crew working in concert to ensure their escape. It was a delicate operation, one miscalculation away from disaster, but they were nothing if not adaptable. As they put distance between themselves and the battlefield, a sense of triumph settled over the crew. Their plan, crazy and reckless as it was, had worked. They'd outmaneuvered their enemies and lived to tell the tale. Corin nodded, a rare smile crossing his features. "You humans are truly remarkable, and you Gorthons aren't so bad yourselves," Vesper replied, her own smile wide and unrestrained. As the stars stretched out before them, the crew of the diplomatic disaster reveled in their victory, their laughter echoing through the ship like a song of defiance. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd managed to turn the tables and make it out alive. And as they sailed into the unknown, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. Because if there was one thing they'd learned, it was that in the grand cosmic game of survival, it wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It was about being the craziest one in the room and knowing how to play your hand when the stakes were high. And in that, the crew of the diplomatic disaster excelled beyond measure. The diplomatic disaster drifted through the wreckage-strewn void like an old shoe caught in a flash flood, navigating past the smoldering remnants of what had once been fearsome Sleens and stubborn Gorthons. The cosmic ballet of violence had spun itself out, leaving behind a silence as thick as the air of Zolara, if you could call an atmosphere that felt like drowning in soup air. Vesper leaned back in her seat, the leather creaking sympathetically under her weight. "Well," she said, rubbing her temples, "we survived. That's more than I expected from this suicide mission." Anybody else feel like they've just walked out of a bar brawl with their dignity somewhat intact? Jack snorted, flipping a switch on the console with the nonchalance of a man who just discovered a new way to dodge work. "I'd say we walked out of that bar brawl, stole everyone's wallets, and set the place on fire for good measure. Don't forget leaving a fake confession taped to the door," Riff added over the earpiece. "Just to make sure they never invite us back." "Yeah, well, they can keep their happy hour specials," Vesper said, stretching her arms until her elbows popped. "I could use a vacation, maybe somewhere the air won't try to strangle me every time I breathe." As the ship cruised away from the obliterated battlefield, Corin stood at the viewport, arms crossed over his broad chest. His reflective gaze seemed to digest the cosmic wreckage, chewing over the consequences like a steak that was a little too tough. "Zolara is broken," he mused, "but maybe that's what it needed. Sometimes you have to smash the vase to make something new, or to make sure no one else can put flowers in it," Vesper countered. "Either way, it's done. We've given Zolara a chance to start fresh, whether they seize it or not." "Not our problem." The ship's console beeped with a new transmission, the holographic display projecting Zolara's surface with an optimism that bordered on delusional. The planet's two halves, once locked in eternal contention, now had space to breathe, quite literally, given the decommissioning of their vast armadas. Burak and T-Ren shuffled into the room, still wearing expressions that suggested they'd just seen ghosts doing the cha-cha on the hull. "Peace talks are back on," Burak said, his voice a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Reports say both sides are willing to negotiate. No one's tried to blow up the conference center, yet. Maybe they finally realized there's more to life than endless war," T-Ren added, with the enthusiastic optimism of a hostage negotiating their own release. "Or maybe they just ran out of things to blow up," Jax interjected, crossing his arms and leaning back in his chair. "Even pyromaniacs get tired when the matches run out." Vesper rubbed her chin thoughtfully. "If those two species can figure out how to play nice, maybe there's hope for the rest of the galaxy. Who knows, maybe we'll see Sleens and Gorthons having a picnic someday." "Yeah, right," Riff quipped. "And maybe pigs will start piloting starships." "I'd like to see a Sleens eat a cucumber sandwich without trying to stab it first." "Hey, stranger things have happened," Vesper shot back, refusing to let the weight of cynicism dull the blade of their recent victory. "Remember, we're the ones who got out of here alive." The diplomatic disaster glided onwards, carrying its motley crew towards the uncertain embrace of the cosmos. Zolara was left to its own devices, a planet knit together by the absurd threads of a human-crafted conspiracy. And if those threads unraveled in the future, well, that was a problem for another day, another crew. "Think we'll ever come back?" Jax asked, his voice tinged with curiosity, as if the galaxy was a game of cards and he'd just been dealt a wild hand. "If we do, let's hope it's for a vacation," Vesper replied, her tone light but her eyes carrying the weight of all they'd seen. "And that Zolara has learned how to mix a decent cocktail by then." With that, the crew settled into the comfortable chaos of routine, the ship humming its familiar, comforting tune around them. It was a melody composed of misadventures, close calls, and the peculiar anthem of surviving against all odds. As they left Zolara behind, Vesper allowed herself to exhale, the tension of the past few days finally seeping out of her like air from a punctured balloon. The weight of leadership, that constant companion, now felt a touch lighter, a reminder that even the heaviest burdens can be carried with a grin and a helping of sarcasm. For all its flaws, humanity had once again proven its resilience, turning what seemed like an inevitable disaster into a surprising success. And maybe, just maybe, the universe had taken note. Maybe it saw that the most unlikely of species could still wield chaos like a weapon, could still carve paths through the impossible. As the diplomatic disaster set course for the unknown, Vesper smiled into the void. They'd done the impossible, and in a universe teetering on the brink of insanity, that was something worth celebrating. "Here's to being the craziest ones in the room," she murmured to herself, the words barely audible over the ship's steady hum. And to whatever madness comes next. The crew of the diplomatic disaster had faced the void and emerged, if not unscathed, then at least unbowed. And that was victory enough in a cosmos that thrived on chaos and absurdity. So here's to the next adventure, wherever it might be. Because if there was one thing Vesper and her crew had learned, it was that the universe was full of surprises, and they were more than ready to meet them head-on, with a smile, a wink, and perhaps a touch of madness. As the ship sailed into the black, the crew settled back, each member lost in the silent reflection of their own thoughts. The universe was vast, unpredictable, and often downright unfriendly. But in its own weird way, that was exactly what made it worth exploring. "Bring it on," Vesper said, the words a quiet challenge to whatever lay beyond the stars. With laughter echoing in the corridors and the promise of adventure on the horizon, the diplomatic disaster continued its journey, a testament not to the perfection of its crew, but to their irrepressible spirit and indomitable will. Because sometimes, against all odds, the universe gave you a chance. And if you were crazy enough to seize it, who knew what wonders awaited? And so, with hope and a healthy dose of irreverence, the saga of the diplomatic disaster sailed boldly into the unknown, ready for whatever the cosmos had in store. In the aftermath of chaos, with Zolara's faction starting to heal, Vesper reflected on the beautiful absurdity of it all, how human stupidity had been wielded as a weapon, and how, against the backdrop of the stars, it had somehow morphed into an unpredictable strength. Maybe, she mused, that was the real magic of humanity, the ability to stumble through the dark and still find light. Against all odds, to find a way to not just survive, but thrive. And in that, the crew of the diplomatic disaster excelled beyond measure.